If the world were to collapse in front of you today, where would you run first? To your strength? To your money? To someone who promised to stay? Or would you discover, too late, that you built your security on things that can't even sustain their own shadow? There are times when life doesn't warn, doesn't negotiate, doesn't give you time. It just shakes, and what's loose inside us falls along with it. Charles Spurgeon, with the firmness of one who knew both pain and glory, said that true faith is not that which works when everything is going well, but that which remains when all human support breaks down. And that is precisely why Psalm 46 does not begin with fragile consolation, nor with a vague promise. It begins with an absolute, direct sentence, impossible to ignore. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. It is not maybe. It is not who knows. It is not someday. It is now. It is real. It is present. There's a type of phrase that isn't meant to embellish a service. It's meant to save a collapsing mind. It's meant to lift up a broken heart. And what the psalmist does here is cast an anchor at the bottom of the abyss before the abyss even opens its mouth. Spurgeon would treat this verse as an iron gate closing in the face of fear, because refuge isn't a pretty setting, it's a safe hiding place. A fortress isn't a religious symbol, it's a place where the enemy has no access. A very present help isn't a metaphor, it's God's intervention when you feel you've reached your limit. So notice this detail. The text doesn't deny the chaos, it confronts it head on. It acknowledges that tribulation, siege, hardship, pressure, and threat exist. But it doesn't allow suffering to become the master. It doesn't let fear govern the conscience. Because there's a difference between being in danger and being without God. The first situation is frightening. The second is destructive. And that is why this psalm grows like a ladder of revelation. It is not a loose thought, it is a path. It leads us through three scenes that fit together as prophecy and reality. First, the world in turmoil. Then, the besieged city. Finally, the silent battlefield, full of broken weapons. As if the Spirit were showing that God is not just an idea for Sunday, but a refuge for the worst day of existence. Spurgeon saw Scripture this way, not as a dead text, but as a living blade. And when he read, "God is our refuge," it was as if heaven shouted in man's ear, "Stop trusting in sandcastles," because the question is inevitable. Where is your true confidence? Not the pretty answer you give others. Real confidence, the kind that appears when the ground disappears beneath your feet. Do you trust what you possess? What you control? What you planned? What you built? The problem with trusting earthly things is that they have an expiration date. The problem with trusting people is that people break. The problem with trusting yourself is that the human heart is unstable, and the mind, when wounded, becomes a cruel tribunal. And then, when tribulation arrives, what seemed firm reveals itself to be fragile. Spurgeon warned that many only seek God as a last resort, but God is not the last door. He is the only door that does not collapse. That is why the psalmist does not offer techniques. He offers a person. He does not promise the absence of struggle. He promises God's presence. And presence, when it is divine, changes everything. Because the God who is refuge not only receives you, he becomes the ground beneath you. And then comes the phrase that sounds like a challenge against reality itself. Therefore, we will not fear. How can anyone say that looking at a scene of ruin? How can anyone affirm that when everything threatens to break? The answer lies not in the temperament of man, but in the nature of God. The psalm does not point to natural courage. It points to a supernatural certainty. It says, "Though the earth be removed, though mountains fall into the sea, though its waters roar and foam, we will not fear. Not because we are strong, but because God does not fall." Now think about this honestly. What if today were your even if day? What if the stability you love were ripped away today? What if the news you fear arrived? What would hold you back? What would stop your mind from turning into a battlefield? This is where Psalm 46 ceases to be a reading and becomes a mirror. It wasn't written for those who live in peace. It was written for those who need refuge. And the first truth is thrown like a stone into the middle of the sea. There is a place that chaos does not invade. This place is not an absence of problems. It is the presence of God. But if this is true, an inevitable question remains in the air, burning inside. If God is refuge, why do so many continue to hide in things that cannot save? There are times when life doesn't collapse with an explosion, but with silence. You wake up, grab your phone, and before you even get out of bed, you already feel a tightening in your chest. A short message changes your whole day. A "we need to talk" becomes a weight in your stomach. An appointment, an overdue bill, news in the family group chat, a quick video on social media showing that the world is worse than yesterday. And suddenly, what seemed normal begins to tremble inside. It's not an earthquake on the ground, it's an earthquake in your soul. And it's at that moment that the question appears uninvited. Where is your strength when you realize you control nothing? Charles Spurgeon had a direct way of shattering human illusion without destroying the person. He knew that the heart likes to deceive itself to avoid fear. He knew that we call security that which only distracts us. And so he would push us to the heart of Psalm 46, as if holding a man by the shoulder and saying, "Look again. It is not you who sustains life. It is God." Because the psalmist is not merely describing a refuge, he is exposing what happens when the true refuge is not God. God is our refuge. And when the Bible uses this word, it's not talking about superficial comfort. Refuge is a place of escape when someone is being pursued. It's shelter for those who are trapped. It's a roof for those who have no way to defend themselves. Spurgeon would say that God's refuge is not like a beautiful house you visit to take a picture. It's like a fortress where you run in, your heart racing, and suddenly realize that the doors close behind you and the fear no longer goes away. And the text continues, God is our fortress. Here the psalm cuts through pride. Because fortress is that which does not fall when everything else falls. Fortress is that which withstands repeated blows. And most people try to transform fragile things into fortresses. Some people make money a wall until the day they lose it. Some people make their own bodies a guarantee until the day they get sick. Some people make another person a base until the day they are abandoned. Some people make mental control a protection until the day anxiety wins and thought becomes a labyrinth without an exit. What seemed strong was just habit. What seemed firm was just routine. And then comes the most intimate and frightening part. God is a very present help in trouble. The word trouble here doesn't mean a small problem. It's a predicament. It's a siege. It's like being in an alley and realizing the way out has disappeared. It's like a sleepless night where you stare at the ceiling, replaying conversations, reliving mistakes, imagining disasters. It's like hearing your child crying in their room and not knowing what to do. It's like getting into the car, closing the door, and before starting the engine feeling the tears welling up because you're tired of being strong. And then comes the surprise that changes everything. The help isn't possible. It's very present. God isn't a phone that rings and no one answers. He is a real presence on the day you thought you would be alone. But here a silent, almost mysterious turning point occurs, and many people don't notice it. The psalm doesn't say that God is a refuge only for isolated individuals. It says, God is our refuge. This means that even when you feel you are struggling alone, there is a greater reality surrounding you. There is a covenant. There is a people. There is a God who calls mine those whom the world calls forgotten. Spurgeon would say this forcefully. Hell tries to convince you that you are a lost cause. God calls you a child and gives you a place to stand. So the psalmist concludes, therefore we will not fear. And this seems impossible because fear always screams first. But understand, not fearing is not pretending it hurts less. Not fearing is having a foundation that doesn't break. Fear grows when your world is small. Faith grows when God becomes great. And Spurgeon would say that faith is not a pretty feeling. It's a decision in the face of truth. You can have a trembling heart and still say, I will not surrender. Now imagine a common scene. You're on the street on any given day. and your phone vibrates. You see the name on the screen and your body reacts immediately. Some people live like this, with their hearts always on high alert, waiting for the next blow. Psalm 46 acts as a cut in this emotional slavery. It doesn't promise that the phone won't ring. It promises that when it does ring, you won't be destroyed, because there is a refuge above circumstances. And the question returns, sharper now. If God is a fortress, why do you keep trying to protect yourself with things that can't withstand a single difficult night? The answer may hurt, but it sets you free. Perhaps you've used the wrong fortresses. Perhaps you've called what was merely a distraction security. And perhaps that's why the next step in the psalm is so necessary. It will show that chaos doesn't always come in the form of personal problems. Sometimes chaos comes as a world in fury, and when that happens, faith is tested in a way you didn't expect. There's a type of chaos that doesn't originate within the home, but arrives through the window of the world. You didn't provoke it, you didn't plan it, you didn't choose it, and yet it knocks on your door. Sometimes it comes as breaking news, sometimes as a collective crisis, sometimes as fear spreading in the air, as if the atmosphere itself were charged. It's the kind of turbulence that makes people realize that life isn't as predictable as it seemed. And it's precisely here that Psalm 46 becomes more than just an ancient text. It becomes a survival manual for when reality changes shape. The psalmist doesn't try to protect faith with light phrases. He does the opposite. He throws faith into the heart of the earthquake. He says, "Though the earth be shaken," as if the earth were not just ground, but a symbol of everything you considered firm. Because the earth, in human language, is stability, its routine, its foundation. It's what we step on without thinking. And when the text says that the earth can be shaken, it's saying that even what you don't question can collapse. The psalm isn't offering cheap peace. It's offering God as an anchor when the world ceases to be the world. This image is brutal. Mountains shake in the bosom of the seas, waters churn and foam, mountains tremble. It's as if all of creation is reminding man that he is not sovereign. And the curious thing is that this type of scenario isn't just about natural catastrophe. It describes a spiritual experience, when life loses its form, when the future becomes a fog, when what seemed distant becomes a real threat. At that moment, you understand that you control neither time nor people nor your own body. And the question that arises isn't theological, it's existential, it's raw, it's human. What holds you back when nothing else does? Have you ever noticed how the mind tries to negotiate with chaos? It looks for numbers, statistics, experts, predictions. It looks for anything that restores a sense of control. But there's a point where human control simply doesn't reach. And Psalm 46 touches precisely on this. No one, however intelligent, prepared, or powerful, can contain a convulsion of reality. There are forces that ignore our defenses. There are circumstances that shatter our certainties. And so the psalmist doesn't say, "We will understand everything." He says, "Therefore, we will not fear." This is a shock, because human logic would say, "Therefore, we will be afraid." The text reverses the flow. Faith is not born from the absence of danger. Faith is born from the presence of God. And here's a perspective that almost no one notices. The psalm doesn't call chaos an illusion. It doesn't spiritualize suffering as if it were theater. It acknowledges chaos as real, but reveals that it is not final. This changes everything, because many people confuse faith with denial. But biblical faith is lucidity. It looks at the roaring sea and doesn't lie to itself. It simply doesn't grant the sea the right to rule the heart. The world may be in fury, but the throne is not in fury. Creation may tremble, but the Creator does not lose dominion. And when you understand this, fear loses some of its power. If you could choose, would you prefer a life without tremors or a life with an unbreakable foundation? What is stronger, the absence of crisis or the presence of a God who goes through crisis with you? Do you want peace that depends on the world or peace that depends on the throne? There is an even deeper detail in this scene. When the psalm speaks of mountains falling into the sea, it describes the collapse of what seemed immense. Mountains, in the human imagination, are symbols of permanence. They seem eternal, but the text says, even they can crumble. This is a revelation that wounds pride, because many people live as if certain structures were untouchable: health, employment, security, reputation, the stability of the country, the strength of an institution, the protection of a routine. But when God allows the ground to tremble, it is not to humiliate you. It is to free you from the idolatry of the predictable. Psalm 46 is not a text to destroy hope. It is a text to transfer hope to the right place. And there is an unexpected, almost secret revelation here. Nature in turmoil is also a mercy, because it shatters the illusion that man is in control. It forces the soul to choose its center. It exposes what was trust and what was habit. It reveals whether you were steadfast in God or merely comfortable in the world. When all is calm, almost any faith seems great. But when the world roars, only that which is real remains. What if the chaos you fear isn't the greatest danger, but the very setting where your faith will finally become reality? What if the crisis is the tool God uses to pull you out of false strongholds? What if the even if isn't a threat, but a gateway to a level of trust you've never known? The psalmist affirms, "We will not fear because he is not looking at the size of the waves. He is looking at the invisible reality that sustains all things." And this is a unique perspective that needs to be expressed. Faith is not a shield that prevents the storm from arriving. It is an axis that prevents you from spinning along with it. The world may lose its shape, but you don't have to lose your center. And the center is not your strength. The center is God. Now think about what happens inside you when the world screams. Your heart races, your mind races, your imagination conjures up worse scenarios, and your body goes on high alert as if it were being hunted. Psalm 46 doesn't ignore this. It responds to it. It delivers to the heart a phrase capable of halting the escalation of panic. God is our refuge. This isn't cheap psychology. This is covenant. This is governance. This is presence. When you repeat this truth, you are doing something spiritual and real. You are refusing the throne to fear. So I ask you, before we move on to the next scenario in the psalm, when the world seems to be out of control, who do you believe is really in charge? Are you living as if God is distant, or as if he is sitting on the throne? And if God is on the throne, why do you still behave as if you are alone? Because now the text will change the scenario once again. The threat will no longer be the sea or the mountain. The threat will be people, war, siege, enemies. And when the pressure comes from outside with the intention to destroy, you will discover an even more powerful truth. It is not enough for God to be a refuge in the chaos of nature. He needs to be in the midst of his people. And when he is, the city does not fall. There's a moment when Psalm 46 stops talking about earthquakes and storms and begins to speak of something even more intimate, a besieged city. It's no longer the earth trembling beneath our feet. It's the enemy pressing against the gates. And this change of scenery is almost a trap for the human heart, because when the threat comes from nature, we feel small. But when the threat comes from people, we feel targeted. Nature doesn't choose you, it just happens. But human attack has intention. It has malice. It has a message. It has provocation. And it is here that the text reveals a secret that few people understand until they are pressured. The difference between being attacked and being destroyed lies not in the enemy's strength, but in the presence of God. The psalmist declares with precision, God is in the midst of her, she shall not be moved. This phrase is not a spiritual embellishment, it is a verdict. It is like a divine signature on a decree that hell cannot tear up. And the most surprising thing is that the text speaks of a real city, Jerusalem, but carries a greater shadow. Jerusalem is a symbol of God's people. It is the church in battle. It is the church surrounded. It is the church living in the world as one who walks in hostile territory. And this makes the psalm directly touch the daily experience of anyone who tries to remain firm, while everything around them presses to give in. To understand the impact of this, It's necessary to remember a curious fact that many people ignore. Jerusalem, unlike many important capitals, does not have a large river running through it. It was not built around a powerful natural spring like other ancient cities. And yet the psalm states, "There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God." How so, a river where there is no river? Herein lies the first shock of the narrative. The river is not geography, it is presence. It is a symbol of something invisible, but more real than stone and walls. The text is saying that God's people do not survive because they have natural resources, but because they are watered by a spiritual spring that never dries up. And this image becomes even more intriguing when you discover an unlikely historical detail. When Jerusalem was threatened, one of the most dangerous vulnerabilities was water, because besieged cities died of thirst before dying by the sword. King Hezekiah, in an act of strategy, ordered the construction of a tunnel to bring water inside the walls. This was not just engineering, it was survival. The enemy could surround from the outside, but life needed to continue from within. And the psalm uses this kind of logic to reveal something greater. There is a flow that the enemy cannot cut off. There is a current that continues even when the siege tightens. There is a joy that does not depend on external freedom, because it is born from an inner presence. Now think about this in practice. There are people who seem to be doing well on the outside, but are dry on the inside. There are people surrounded by security, but empty. And there are people living surrounded, pressured, threatened, and yet they remain steadfast. Why? Because their hearts have a source, and that source is not an emotion. It is God. The psalm is not describing a perfect city. It is describing a sustained city. The text says that this city is the sanctuary of the dwellings of the Most High, and this detail changes everything, because it points to a fact that many forget. God does not dwell only in places of stone. God dwells in the midst of His people. The true sanctuary is not a building, it is a surrendered life. That is why the psalm boldly affirms, God is in the midst of it. It is not God looking from afar. It is not God watching from above. It is God present, active, involved. And then comes another improbable event that the text suggests, as if it were a scene from a movie, but it really happened. Jerusalem surrounded by powerful enemies and yet preserved. The names of the enemies change throughout the story, but the pattern is the same. The siege seems final. The threat seems insurmountable. Human logic dictates that the fall is certain. And then the unexpected happens. One night can change everything. An intervention can turn the tide. An invisible movement can break the force that seemed invincible. This teaches a truth that the world doesn't like to admit. War is not always won by the largest army, but by the God who decides to intervene. The psalm describes a world in turmoil, nations roaring, kingdoms trembling. And in the midst of this confusion, God's people receive a phrase that serves as a password for survival. The Lord of hosts is with us. This title is not poetic, it is military. It affirms that God commands forces unseen by the eyes. He governs the visible and the invisible. He has resources that don't appear in the news. And when He is in the midst of His people, what seemed inevitable can be stopped. Now, a curious detail. The psalm doesn't say the city won't be attacked. It says it won't be shaken. There's a huge difference between those two things. Being attacked is inevitable in a world in conflict. Being shaken is optional when God is present. This isn't arrogance, it's trust. This isn't presumption, it's a promise. And the question that remains, like a light shining in the back of your mind, is direct. If God's presence is what prevents you from falling, what happens when that presence is treated as a detail? What happens when a person replaces the source with cisterns? When they exchange presence for appearances? When they exchange God for routine? The psalm is preparing you to understand that the greatest danger is not the enemy's siege. The greatest danger is distance from God. Because now, just when you think you've seen enough, the text will lead you to a new scenario. It will no longer be the besieged city. It will be the battlefield after the battle. and you will discover something even more impressive. God not only sustains you in the midst of the siege, He ends the war and turns weapons into scrap metal. Suddenly, Psalm 46 changes again, and it feels like someone is taking you by the hand and leading you outside the walls, away from the shelter, to a place where the land is marked. It's no longer the sound of the waters nor the cry of the nations. Now it's the heavy silence of a field after war. And this silence is frightening because it's not empty. It's full of signs. Burnt remains, broken wood, twisted iron. What was once a threat is now on the ground like scrap metal, as proof that someone won. The text says, "Come, behold the works of the Lord." And there is something unsettling about this command. It's not run away. It's not look away. It's behold. As if God were saying, look carefully because you need to learn something that fear tried to hide. The psalm doesn't want you to just survive. It wants you to understand. And when you understand, your faith changes shape. The images are stark. Devastation on the land, broken boughs, shattered spears, chariots burned in the fire. These were the instruments of power of that time. The bow represented reach. The spear represented contact. The chariot represented speed and dominance. When an army possessed chariots, it instilled fear even before arriving. The sound of the wheels was an announcement of defeat. And now the psalm shows the unbelievable. All of this is destroyed. All of this has lost its function. All of this has become a memory. What seemed invincible has turned to ruin. Here's a detail that grabs the mind. The text doesn't say that men destroyed these weapons. It says it was God. He puts an end to war to the ends of the earth. This is a twist, because the world always tries to teach that peace comes from negotiations, treaties, promises, and limits. But the psalm is saying that true peace doesn't spring from human goodwill, because the human heart is unstable. Man can sign an agreement today and break it tomorrow. He can promise peace and secretly prepare for war. He can speak of order while fueling chaos. That's why the text doesn't rely on what man is capable of doing. It relies on what God decides to do. And this is where the tension rises, because the psalm isn't just describing a local conflict. It's talking about something that reaches the ends of the earth. As if all the wars, all the empires, all the threats that have ever arisen in history were just chapters in a book that God has the power to close. This is mind-boggling, because we've become accustomed to living as if violence were eternal, as if evil would always have the last word. And then the text declares, no. God puts an end to it. God breaks it. God shatters it. God burns it. The conclusion does not belong to man. But now comes the verse that changes the tone and becomes a direct confrontation. Be still and know that I am God. This phrase, which many people repeat as if it were merely a soothing balm for the heart, has a different weight here. Here it is not God saying, be calm. Here it is God interrupting human pride. It is as if the Lord entered the center of the confusion and said, stop. Enough. You are not in charge. You are not in control. You are not the center. I am God. And this has a powerful effect because it exposes an uncomfortable reality. There are nations that act as if they are eternal. There are leaders who speak as if they own destiny. There are powers that threaten as if no one could touch them. There are weapons that seem to say, I am in charge. And then God responds with a simple phrase, effortlessly, without shouting. Be still. It is as if he were saying, calm down. You can make noise, but you cannot change my throne. You can plan, but you cannot prevent my decree. At this point, the narrative becomes even more intense because you realize that the psalm isn't just talking about the world outside. It's talking about the world within us. Because how many times do we try to control everything as if we were God? How many times does anxiety become a form of idolatry, as if worrying were a way to govern the future? How many times does the heart create scenarios to avoid being surprised, but end up living imprisoned in fear? And then comes the command, be still, not as a light invitation, but as a call to the right place. Return to the center, return to the throne, return to what is real. And then comes the phrase that heightens the anticipation for the outcome. I am exalted among the nations. I am exalted in the earth. This means that, in the end, God not only wins, he will be recognized. He not only ends the war, he shows who has always been in control. He not only protects his people, he reveals his glory before the world. And this changes the way we look at chaos, because chaos is not greater than purpose. Confusion is not greater than sovereignty. Night is not greater than light. Now imagine this scene applied to real life. You look at everything that seemed impossible, at everything that seemed like the final threat, and one day, you realize that it has lost its power. What dominated you no longer dominates you. What haunted you has become ruin. What frightened you is now in the past. You look and think, how did this happen? And the psalm answers, the works of the Lord. It wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't just time. It was God acting where no one else could act. And this is where the final tension builds, because the text is about to repeat a phrase as a seal of security, as if God wanted to engrave it in your mind twice, so that you don't forget when fear returns. And when that phrase is spoken, it will act as the key that locks everything and at the same time opens the last door. If the Lord of hosts is with us, why do you still live as if you were alone? After depicting the world in turmoil, the besieged city, and the ruined battlefield, Psalm 46 ends as if God wanted to leave a phrase engraved on your heart, not just in your mind. Because there is a kind of truth that wasn't meant to be remembered only on good days. It was meant to be used when the heart is weak, when the news weighs heavily, when the soul feels it is losing its breath. And that is why the text repeats like a seal, like an anchor, like a signature that fear cannot erase. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Notice that he doesn't say the Lord of hosts was, or perhaps is. He says is. That changes everything, because many people suffer not only from the problem they face, but from the feeling of abandonment. The pain is greater when it seems you are alone, and that's where this psalm comes in as real help. It doesn't promise that you will never be attacked. It promises that you will never be without God. It doesn't say that you won't hear the noise of the world. It says that there is a presence stronger than that noise. The God of Jacob is our refuge. And this detail is powerful, because Jacob was a man full of flaws, fears, and contradictions. Jacob was a deceiver and was deceived. Jacob fell and rose again. Jacob had nights of flight and days of struggle, and yet God decided to make a covenant with him. This means that God is not a refuge only for those who consider themselves strong. He is a refuge for the weary, for the guilty, for those who are trying to start over. The psalm is saying that your past has no more authority than the grace of God. Your mistake is not greater than mercy. Your weakness is not greater than the power of the Lord. Now perhaps you're thinking, how do I apply this in practice? How do I bring this truth into my routine, my mind, my decisions, my daily life? The path begins with a simple yet profound choice. When fear comes, don't argue with it for hours. Return to your refuge. And refuge isn't just a feeling. Refuge is a direction. It's when you stop running towards the same things that always fail and consciously run towards God. The first practical action is this. Interrupt the storm within you with a clear declaration. When your heart races, say aloud, if you can, God is my refuge and my fortress. The Lord of hosts is with me. This is not empty repetition. It is alignment. It is you reminding your own soul who governs. Because often the problem is not the chaos outside. It is the chaos that settles inside. The second action is to review where you have placed your security. Ask yourself honestly, am I trusting in God or am I trusting in control? Am I trusting in God or in people? Am I trusting in God or in money? Am I trusting in God or in my own strength? Because all of these things can fail, and when they fail, the soul collapses along with them. But when God is your center, circumstances can change without destroying you. The third action is to protect God's presence in your life. The psalm showed that the city is only unshakable because God is in its midst. And what threatens this presence is sin, coldness, distance, and neglect of the soul. So practice something simple. Put God back in the place of priority. Set aside time for prayer, even if it's short. Read the Word, even if it's just a passage a day. Reduce the excess of voices that make you anxious. Not all information deserves to enter your mind. Not all news deserves to dominate your heart. You don't need to feed fear to be informed. You need to feed faith to remain standing. The fourth action is to transform be still into a posture. Calming down here is not pretending that nothing exists. It's stopping acting as if you were God. It's surrendering what you cannot control. It's accepting that there is a throne above your pain. It's breathing, keeping your mind steady and saying, I will not rebel against God because of the chaos of the world. I will trust. I will walk. I will obey. I will remain. And then comes the final step. Live as someone who already has refuge. This changes your decisions. It changes your reactions. It changes your choices. Those who have refuge don't live in despair. Those who have refuge don't need to destroy themselves in advance. Those who have refuge don't need to lose hope with every piece of bad news. You can get through the day with dignity, with faith, with courage, with peace. Not because you are strong, but because God is faithful. If you've come this far today feeling like the world is heavy, I want you to hold on to this truth like the phrase that sustains your soul when everything is shaking. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. God has not lost control. God has not been removed from the throne. God has not forgotten you. Even if the earth trembles, he remains. Even if the nations roar, he reigns. Even if the war seems long, he brings it to an end. And in the end, the last word will not be fear. It will be the Lord's. If this message resonated with you, like the video now to help the channel reach more people. Comment below what touched your heart the most, even if you prefer to comment anonymously or with few words. And subscribe to the channel, because we will continue our journey together through texts that strengthen the mind, heal the soul, and restore your faith.